Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted these gigantic Centurions. And by gigantic, I mean incredibly tiny. These are 285th scale Centurions from GHQ, and I did make an assembly video for these a while ago. It is quite a long watch, but if you've got a few hours to spare, there's a link to that video in the description. Otherwise, let's get straight to the painting. The models were blue tacked onto popsicle sticks, and then primed with Stynylrez Res Black Primer, which I think is a rather good primer, but if you're painting, feel free to use whichever primer you like best. The next thing I do is airbrush on a base coat of Hataka Khaki Green No. 3, or as the box it came in says, Camouflage Green. It's also known as Olive Drab Lusterless, having no luster because it's a very matte colour. Whatever you want to call it, it's a nice colour, which I believe to be suitable for a Vietnam-era Centurion. And even if it's not suitable, I still think it looks good, which really is the important part. As with most paints, a couple of thin coats is the ideal way to apply this. Once it's dry, it will look a little bit darker, which is fine. I didn't bother airbrushing any highlights onto this, but I did apply a coat of Army Painter Military Shader, to shade things in a military way, I guess. This should darken things down a bit, and it works really nice over greens. It was mixed in a very rough ratio of approximately 1 part water to 3 parts military shader, and I simply paint it all over the model, and I'm being careful not to let it pool up anywhere, because that leaves tide marks which look kind of bad. If you do this and you don't think it's dark enough, you can always just let it dry, and then apply it again. Just because I didn't airbrush any highlights doesn't mean that I'm not going to add any, so I use the base colour Hataka Khaki Green No. 3 and apply a highlight using a dry brush. As I usually do, I'm using a makeup brush to do this. It's a small domed blending brush, I think it is? I don't remember, but this works really well for dry brushing models. I'm focusing on the edges and raised details here, as I normally do with highlighting. Obviously it's just bringing the base coat back out after the wash, and leaving the darker bits in the recesses and such darker. I add some more highlighting with the same brush, and the same base colour, but this time I've added a tiny bit of Vallejo Model Air white to it. I would normally use a buff colour to lighten just about any colour, because it does so in a more gentle and subtle way, but this was on my desk and I was lazy, so why not? It still works, but I'm being careful to only use a small amount of white so that it wouldn't be too stark a highlight. I apply it pretty much the same way as the previous dry brushing, just I was being a fair bit lighter with it. I really only want this to be subtle and on the edges and not to overpower the previous highlighting. I also got the wheels with this. I figure having the hubs highlighted would make them stand out a bit. You can see it's a pretty subtle effect, but it is there. In case it's too subtle for you to be able to tell, the one with the second dry brushing is on the right side. Now for a little bit of detail painting, starting with the tracks. For this I'm using Rust Tracks from Ammo by MiG. This is a really nice rusty colour for tracks, as the name kind of implies. Painting tracks isn't usually too tricky, but when they're this tiny, it does become a little bit fiddly, though as long as you're careful and you take your time, it's not too hard. I'm sure it's probably quite obvious for me to say that I'm applying the colour to all of the track surfaces that will be visible. Yes, it is very obvious! Also, I'm not worrying too much about getting this paint on the outsides of the road wheels. That'll be painted over anyway. I use the same rusty colour to add a touch of rustiness to the exhausts, because they're kind of rusty looking. The mufflers have covers and I'm pretty sure they should stay green, but the pipe itself, which pokes out the back, should be a rusty colour. It's clearly tiny, so a tiny brush and some slow, careful application of paint is the way to do this. The next thing I did was to paint the road wheels, and for this I'm using Ammo by MiG rubber and tyres, because these are both rubber and tyres. I'm using a very small brush for this. I forget the size, but I think it was 10/0, and this was probably the most time-consuming part of this. Mistakes can of course be fixed here, but I would rather not fix it, so I'm just being very careful to not make mistakes. Being careful and going slowly and taking your time is a pretty good way to avoid making mistakes. They can still happen, but it is a good way to avoid them. Because these are Australian Centurions, there's a pair of spare road wheels on the front plate, and of course I painted those with the same rubber and tyres colour. This is also fiddly, but slightly less so than those on the sides of the tank. I feel like it really adds a lot of interest having these painted, and because I liked that, I figured I might as well paint some tools for even more interest. On the tank's right, I painted the shovel head and the bar alongside the shovel, which is pretty hard to see. And on the left, I painted the pickaxe heads. For this, I've used Vallejo model colour German Grey. I figured that would be a dark enough colour. Obviously these bits are tiny, and you would be forgiven for just not painting them at all, but I feel like it does add a little something. A kind of difficult to see something, but something all the same. For the wooden handles on the shovel and pickaxes, I used Vallejo model colour German Camo medium brown. It's pretty likely that neither colour I painted the tools with is at all correct, and somebody might have a cry about that in the comments, but I just don't care. They seemed reasonable to me, and what matters is that it's adding a bit of interest and breaking up the green colour a little bit, and really only a very little bit, but it is a bit, so it counts. Next, I figured maybe it was time for a wash. Yeah, we can smell you from here! Not that kind of wash. I used Army Painter Darktone here, in a ratio of roughly 3 parts Darktone to 1 part water, and I'm pretty much just painting it onto the tracks and around the bottom of the road wheels. The goal here is to darken down the tracks a bit and add some shadow, and hopefully cover up some of the slight mistakes around where the wheels contact the tracks. I also put a tiny bit of this in the vent on the engine deck, because why not? It does add a little bit of depth there. And then I figure that's about it for the paint. There are no markings because I didn't have any microscopic decals, and there's no way I'm even going to attempt hand painting markings here, so I applied a coat of Lucky Matte varnish. Then, after the varnish dried, I thought it might be a nice touch to apply some chrome to the searchlights, and for this I've used a Molotow liquid chrome pen. Being quite a ding-dong, I didn't film myself doing this, but you can tell that I did it because there are now shiny bits. And that's it. I'm calling these GHQ Centurions in 285th scale completed. This was quite a fun little project, and it was relatively quick and simple. Well, at least simple in technique and colours used. As you can imagine, the tiny size of these tanks does increase the fiddliness and difficulty just a little bit, but on the other hand, it does mean that you can omit a lot of things and it will still look good, especially if you're using the arm's length rule, which, as the name might imply, is where you paint something so that it looks good when you hold it at arm's length, and if it looks good closer than arm's length, that's a bonus. And this is the way I usually paint. I'm pretty happy with the result I've got here. I think you might agree that they do look rather Centurion. Of course, they're not painted with as much detail as you might see on a larger scale tank, and I think the reason for that is quite obvious, but I'm sure somebody is still going to moan about it. I do have a few more of these GHQ tanks in this scale to paint, but I will have to spend hours and hours assembling them, but eventually they'll be ready, and I'll do more of these. I've actually forgotten which tanks they are, but they're cool tanks, so look forward to that, eventually. I don't feel like I've got much else to say about these. I mean, I like them, but I don't think I've done anything out of the ordinary or innovative here or anything like that, which is totally fine. You don't have to do amazing new things or whatever every time you paint, as long as you're getting results that you are happy with. Anyway, if you want to emulate my paint job, or you just like the colours I've used and you're looking for ideas for your own paint job, I'll put a list of the colours I used in the description below. Feel free to do with that information what you like. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. If you've painted one of these Centurions or any other GHQ tanks, or really anything else that's cool and you want to share, why not drop by our friendly Discord community and show us some pictures? We'd love to see what you've done. And if you've not already done so, why not subscribe here on YouTube? It's free, and I think it would just be gosh darn wonderful. Or maybe, if you've got the means, and you want to help a Herbert Erpaderp do Herbert Erpaderp things, and see my videos a bit early, consider becoming a patron. You can find links to Patreon, and all of my other things like Discord and social media in the description below. And, as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other, have an amazing day, and thanks for watching. Farewell.